March 1943. A chateau in occupied France, 50 miles north of Paris. A German Wehrmacht colonel named Heinrich Müller is celebrating his promotion to general. His staff has prepared a dinner party, and Müller has been saving a special bottle of champagne for exactly this occasion, a 1928 Moet and Chandon that he'd requisitioned from the chateau's wine cellar months ago. The bottle sits on the dining table, surrounded by German officers in dress uniforms. Müller stands, picks up the bottle, and begins to remove the wire cage around the cork. His adjutant raises a glass in anticipation of the toast. Müller twists the cork. There's a pop, but not the gentle pop of escaping carbonation. This is a sharp, violent crack followed by a massive explosion that obliterates the dining room. When the smoke clears, Müller and 3 other officers are dead. 4 more are critically wounded. The entire room is destroyed. The Gestapo arrives to investigate the next morning. They find fragments of the champagne bottle mixed with the debris. Their initial theory is that the French resistance somehow planted explosives in the room. But there's a problem with that theory. The room had been guarded all evening, and no one had entered or left except the German officers themselves. Then one investigator finds something strange, a small piece of metal mixed with the glass fragments. It's part of a detonator mechanism. And it was inside the champagne bottle. The terrible realization begins to dawn: the champagne bottle itself was the bomb. Müller had stored it, displayed it, and protected it for months. He had personally carried it to the dining table. He had twisted the cork himself. And in doing so, he had killed himself and his staff with a weapon so cleverly disguised that he never suspected it was anything other than a bottle of expensive French champagne. This was the work of the SOE, the British Special Operations Executive, and their absolutely diabolical explosive wine bottle program. Between 1942 and 1944, the SOE manufactured thousands of these deadly bottles and distributed them throughout occupied Europe. They looked identical to real wine and champagne bottles. They weighed the same. They even sloshed convincingly when shaken. But inside was not wine, it was high explosive designed to kill whoever opened the bottle. This is the story of how wine bottles became one of the most psychologically devastating weapons of World War II, how they were made, how they killed, and why they terrified German officers so much that many refused to drink French wine for the rest of the war. To understand the explosive wine bottle, we need to understand the organization that created it, the Special Operations Executive. The SOE was established by British Prime Minister Winston Churchill in July 1940 with a simple directive: set Europe ablaze. Churchill wanted an organization that would conduct sabotage, espionage, and unconventional warfare behind enemy lines in occupied Europe. The SOE recruited an unusual mix of people, not just soldiers, but also engineers, chemists, artists, magicians, forgers, and anyone with skills that could be useful in unconventional warfare. One of the SOE's most important departments was Station 9, a secret research facility located at the Fryther, a requisitioned hotel in Hertfordshire, England. Station 9 was responsible for developing special weapons and devices for covert operations. This is where the explosive wine bottle was born. The man who conceived the idea was Major Christopher Clayton Hutton, known as Cloutier to his colleagues. Hutton had worked in military intelligence in World War I and had a background in magic and theatrical effects. He understood the principle that would later be called hiding in plain sight, that the best way to smuggle something past security is to make it look like something completely ordinary and expected. Hutton's insight was simple but brilliant: German officers loved wine. Occupied France had thousands of chateaux with well-stocked wine cellars. German officers were requisitioning these wines constantly, which was a polite word for stealing them. What if some of those bottles were actually bombs? The psychological appeal was perfect. Wine bottles were everywhere in occupied France. They were expected. They were desirable. German officers would pick them up, transport them, store them, and eventually open them, all without suspicion. And the wine bottle had a natural triggering mechanism built in. Opening the bottle would naturally involve twisting, pulling, or otherwise manipulating the cork. That manipulation could trigger a detonator. Hutton presented his concept to the technical team at Station 9 in early 1942. The challenge was significant: create a fake wine bottle that would fool close inspection, contain enough explosive to be lethal, and have a reliable detonation mechanism that would trigger when opened but not during handling or transport. The team got to work. They started by obtaining authentic French wine bottles, Bordeaux, Burgundy, Champagne, and other varieties. They carefully removed the original contents, cleaned the bottles, and studied every detail of their construction. French wine bottles in the 1940s were made of thick, dark glass that would help conceal contents. They had distinctive shapes, labels, and cork sealing methods that were familiar to anyone who knew wine. The SOE's fake bottles would need to match all these details perfectly. The explosive filling presented the first technical challenge. The interior volume of a wine bottle is about 750 milliliters. The team needed to fit enough explosive into this space to ensure lethality, while also leaving room for the detonation mechanism. They chose a plastic explosive, a moldable explosive compound that could be shaped to fit the bottle's interior and would be stable during handling. But simply filling a bottle with explosive wasn't enough. The bottle needed to feel right when handled. Real wine bottles have a certain weight and balance. When you pick one up, it feels heavy in a specific way. When you tilt it, you can feel the liquid inside sloshing. The SOE team addressed this by creating a clever three-layer design. The bottom two-thirds of the bottle contained the explosive charge, approximately 500 grams of plastic explosive, enough to kill everyone within a 10-foot radius and cause serious injuries up to 30 feet away. The top third of the bottle contained a sealed compartment filled with actual wine. This compartment was just large enough to create the right weight and to produce a convincing sloshing sound when the bottle was tilted or shaken. Between the wine compartment and the explosive was the detonation mechanism, a spring-loaded striker and detonator cap that would be released when the cork was twisted or pulled. The external appearance had to be perfect. The SOE employed skilled craftsmen who recreated authentic-looking labels for various French wines and champagnes. They studied the typography, paper texture, ink composition, and even the aging patterns on old labels. They forged wine producer seals, import stamps, and vintage markings. Each bottle was then aged to look appropriately dusty and old. Some were given deliberately scratched or damaged labels to make them look like they'd been stored in cellars for years. The cork sealing was crucial. Real French wine bottles were sealed with driven corks topped with wax or with wire cages for champagne bottles. The SOE's bottles needed to look identically sealed while still allowing the detonation mechanism to function. They developed cork assemblies that looked completely normal from the outside but were actually connected to the striker mechanism inside. By mid-1942, Station 9 had perfected the design. The explosive wine bottles were virtually indistinguishable from real ones. You could pick one up, examine it, tilt it to hear the wine sloshing, check the label and seal, and see absolutely nothing suspicious. Only by X-raying the bottle or by doing a detailed weight analysis compared to a real bottle of the same type would you detect that something was wrong. And even then, you'd need to suspect it was fake in the first place. The SOE began production in quantity. Between 1942 and 1944, they manufactured several thousand explosive wine bottles of various types: Bordeaux, Burgundy, Champagne, Cognac, and other varieties. Each bottle was a precision-made deadly weapon disguised as one of life's simple pleasures. But manufacturing the bottles was only half the challenge. The harder part was getting them into the hands, or rather, onto the tables, of German officers in occupied territory. The SOE faced a unique challenge in deploying explosive wine bottles. How do you get deadly fake wine bottles into German officers' wine collections without arousing suspicion? The solution involved several clever distribution methods. The first method was direct placement by SOE agents and French resistance members. British agents operating in France would infiltrate chateau wine cellars known to be targeted by German forces. They would remove a few real bottles from the back of the collection and replace them with explosive bottles. When German officers came to requisition wine, they would take the explosive bottles along with the real ones, never knowing that some of their prizes were deadly. This method worked because German officers were stealing so much wine that they never kept careful inventories. They'd raid a cellar, take dozens of bottles, and store them for later enjoyment. The explosive bottles would sit among the real ones, waiting to be opened. The second method was even more devious: sabotaged wine shipments. The SOE learned that German officers were ordering wine directly from French suppliers, who had little choice but to comply with these orders. SOE agents would intercept these shipments, replace some bottles with explosive ones, and reseal the shipment. The Germans would receive their wine delivery, store it, and eventually someone would open an explosive bottle. The third method involved exploiting the black market. In occupied France, there was a thriving black market for luxury goods, including wine. German officers who wanted particularly fine vintages would buy from black market dealers. The SOE made sure that some of those black market dealers had explosive bottles mixed into their inventory. The French resistance was crucial to all these operations. Resistance members included wine merchants, chateau staff, railway workers, and truck drivers, people who had legitimate access to wine supplies and transportation. They would receive explosive bottles from SOE drops and integrate them into the wine supply chain at various points. The distribution was deliberately scattered and random. The SOE didn't want patterns that the Germans could detect. Explosive bottles showed up in different regions, different types of wine, different sources. There was no way for German security to predict where the next one would appear. The SOE also created elaborate documentation for their fake bottles. Some came with forged certificates of authenticity, fake receipts from wine merchants, and invented provenance stories. This 1929 Chateau Margaux came from the private collection of the Comte de Rothschild, that kind of thing. These stories made the bottles seem more valuable and more legitimate, reducing any suspicion. By late 1942, explosive wine bottles were being distributed throughout occupied France, and the SOE was starting to get reports of successful deployments, which was their euphemistic term for a German officer being killed by an explosive bottle. The first confirmed kill was in November 1942. A German major in Bordeaux opened what he thought was a bottle of 1934 Chateau Lafite at a dinner party. The explosion killed him and 2 other officers. The Gestapo investigation concluded it was sabotage but couldn't determine how the bottle had been weaponized or how it had gotten into the German officers' mess supplies. More incidents followed. In December 1942, a Wehrmacht captain in Lyon opened a bottle of Burgundy in his requisition department. The explosion killed him and wounded his aide. In January 1943, a Luftwaffe group commander opened a bottle of cognac at his headquarters near Paris. The explosion killed him and destroyed his office. In February 1943, the incident that opened this story, General Müller's death at his promotion dinner. By spring 1943, the explosive wine bottle program was achieving its goals, but not in the way you might expect. The actual number of German officers killed by explosive bottles was relatively small, perhaps 30 to 40 confirmed deaths between 1942 and 1944. But the psychological impact was enormous and out of all proportion to the actual casualties. Because here's what happened: German officers became terrified of French wine. News of the explosive bottles spread through the Wehrmacht, Luftwaffe, and SS officers who had previously enjoyed requisitioning fine French wine suddenly became paranoid. Every bottle was now potentially deadly. And there was no way to tell which bottles were real and which were explosive. The Gestapo issued warnings: don't open wine bottles of uncertain provenance. Don't trust wine from French sources. Don't accept wine gifts. But this was almost impossible to enforce. German officers were stationed in France, surrounded by wine, and many of them loved wine. The temptation was constant. Some officers tried to develop testing methods. They'd shake bottles and listen carefully, trying to detect something wrong with the sloshing sound. But the SOE's bottles were engineered to sound exactly like real wine. Some tried weighing bottles, but the weight was correct. Some tried X-raying bottles, but X-ray equipment wasn't readily available at every German installation. The paranoia spread. Some German officers refused to drink any French wine at all. Others would only drink wine that they personally saw opened by someone else, making their subordinates or French staff open bottles first, essentially using them as human mind detectors. Some wealthy officers started importing German wine at great expense, trusting only bottles that came directly from Germany. The SOE realized they'd stumbled onto something bigger than just a weapon. They'd created a psychological warfare tool. The explosive wine bottles were making German officers paranoid, disrupting their social activities, creating distrust between Germans and French, and generally making the occupation more stressful and less enjoyable. So the SOE kept the program running, continuing to distribute explosive bottles throughout the war, not primarily for the handful of casualties they'd cause, but for the widespread fear and paranoia they'd create. There was even a secondary effect: the Germans couldn't retaliate in kind. They couldn't distribute explosive wine bottles to British officers because Britain wasn't occupied and didn't have German agents with access to British supply chains. It was an asymmetric weapon that only worked in one direction. To understand why the explosive wine bottles were so deadly and so difficult to detect, we need to look at the technical details of how they were constructed and how they functioned. A typical SOE explosive wine bottle started with an authentic French wine bottle. Let's say a Bordeaux bottle, the classic tall bottle with straight sides and high shoulders. The bottle would be approximately 12 inches tall and weigh about 1,200 grams when full of wine. The SOE technicians would first carefully remove the original contents. They'd drill a small hole in the bottom of the bottle, drain out the wine, clean the interior thoroughly, and then seal the hole with a glass plug that was nearly invisible. The bottom two-thirds of the bottle's interior would then be filled with plastic explosive, specifically a compound called Nobel 808, which was stable, powerful, and moldable. About 500 grams of this explosive would be packed into the lower part of the bottle. This was enough explosive power to guarantee that anyone within 10 feet of the bottle when it detonated would be killed by the blast and by fragments of the thick glass bottle that would turn into deadly shrapnel. Above the explosive charge, the technicians installed a sealed chamber containing about 200 milliliters of actual wine. This chamber served multiple purposes. First, it provided the correct weight. A bottle containing 500 grams of explosive and nothing else would be noticeably lighter than a real wine bottle. The wine compartment brought the total weight to approximately the correct level. Second, it created the sloshing sound. When someone picked up the bottle and tilted it, they'd hear and feel liquid moving inside, exactly as expected with a real bottle of wine. Third, it made the bottle's contents look right if someone held it up to a light. Through the dark glass of a Bordeaux bottle, you could just barely see the red liquid inside, exactly as you'd expect. The detonation mechanism was the most sophisticated part. It consisted of several components carefully assembled between the wine compartment and the explosive charge below. At the center was a spring-loaded striker, a small metal pin held under tension by a compressed spring. When released, this striker would snap forward and hit a percussion cap, which would in turn detonate the explosive charge. The striker was held in place by a mechanical restraint connected to the cork. The cork itself appeared completely normal from the outside, driven into the bottle neck, sealed with wax, with a vintage capsule covering it. But the bottom of the cork had a metal extension that went down into the bottle's neck and connected to the striker mechanism. When someone twisted the cork to open the bottle, the normal motion you'd use to open any wine bottle, the cork would begin to turn. After about one full rotation, the mechanical restraint on the striker would release. The spring would drive the striker forward into the percussion cap, the cap would explode, and this small explosion would detonate the main explosive charge. The whole sequence happened in a fraction of a second. The person opening the bottle would twist the cork, feel it start to loosen just like a normal cork, and then, explosion. No warning. No chance to react. For champagne bottles, the mechanism was slightly different because champagne corks don't twist, they're held in place by a wire cage and pop out under pressure from the carbonation. The SOE's explosive champagne bottles used a striker mechanism that was released when the cork was pulled upward. When someone removed the wire cage and began to lever out the cork, the upward movement would release the striker. The complexity of these mechanisms was remarkable. They had to be reliable enough to detonate consistently but also stable enough not to detonate accidentally during handling and transport. The bottles might be jostled, dropped, shaken, or subjected to temperature changes during distribution. None of this could trigger premature detonation. The SOE tested their bottles extensively before deployment. They subjected them to vibration tests, drop tests, temperature cycling, and rough handling to ensure they wouldn't detonate accidentally. Then they tested the detonation mechanism to ensure it would fire reliably when the cork was manipulated. The failure rate was reportedly less than 5%, meaning at least 95% of the bottles would explode when opened as designed. The external appearance was perfected through meticulous attention to detail. Each bottle had a label appropriate to its type and supposed vintage. A 1934 Chateau Lafite label would be printed on paper with the right texture and aged appearance. The ink would be period correct. The label would be applied with glue that matched the yellowing and cracking patterns of a real 1934 label that had spent years in a cellar. Some bottles were given deliberately imperfect labels, smudges, small tears, wine stains, because real old bottles from cellars often had damaged labels. A too perfect label might actually arouse suspicion. The bottles were then aged in various ways. Some were stored in damp conditions to encourage the growth of mold on the labels. Some were rolled in dust and cobwebs. Some were given scratches and scuffs on the glass to simulate years of storage and handling. The result was a weapon that was virtually impossible to distinguish from a real bottle without specialized equipment. An expert sommelier examining the bottle carefully might not detect anything wrong. Only an X-ray or a very precise weight measurement against a known authentic bottle would reveal the deception. And importantly, the bottles passed the tests that German security personnel would think to apply. If a German officer was suspicious of a bottle, what would he do? He might shake it, and it would sound normal. He might weigh it in his hands, and it would feel normal. He might examine the label and seal, and they would appear authentic. Short of opening it in a bomb-proof chamber, there was no practical way to determine that the bottle was deadly. By mid-1943, the SOE realized that the explosive wine bottles had become more valuable as instruments of psychological warfare than as assassination tools. The actual body count was relatively small, perhaps 40 to 50 German officers killed over 2 years. But the psychological impact was affecting thousands of German personnel across occupied France. The SOE decided to amplify this psychological effect through a deliberate disinformation campaign. They began spreading rumors about explosive wine bottles through various channels. French resistance radio broadcasts would mention their mysterious explosions killing German officers. Whisper campaigns in bars and cafes would tell stories of Germans dying when opening champagne. Underground newspapers would print warnings to collaborators about the dangers of drinking wine stolen from French cellars. The genius of this campaign was that every word was true, but the scale was exaggerated. The SOE encouraged the perception that explosive bottles were everywhere, that any bottle of French wine might be deadly, and that there was no way to identify safe bottles from dangerous ones. German counterintelligence agencies tried to suppress information about the explosive bottles, but this actually made the problem worse. When the Gestapo ordered that deaths from explosive bottles not be publicized, it meant that German officers heard about these incidents through rumors rather than official channels. And rumors always exaggerate. A single death in Lyon would become several officers killed in multiple incidents by the time the rumor reached Paris. The psychological pressure on German officers was intense and multifaceted. First, there was the direct fear, the knowledge that opening a wine bottle might kill you. This transformed an everyday pleasure into a moment of anxiety. Second, there was social pressure. If you refused to drink French wine out of fear, you might be seen as cowardly by your fellow officers. But if you drank without hesitation, you were taking a real risk. This created a no-win social situation. Third, there was the erosion of trust. Officers became suspicious of wine given as gifts or offered by French contacts. This suspicion extended to other aspects of their interactions with the French population, making the occupation more difficult and less cooperative. Fourth, there was the element of randomness. Unlike a sniper or an ambush, which you might avoid through caution or security measures, there was no way to protect yourself from explosive wine bottles except to completely give up drinking French wine. And for many German officers, this felt like letting the enemy win, letting terrorism dictate their behavior. Some officers tried to reclaim a sense of control through rituals. One Wehrmacht major reportedly developed an elaborate inspection procedure for wine bottles involving shaking, weighing, and examining with a magnifying glass before declaring a bottle probably safe. His fellow officers mocked this as superstition, but several of them secretly adopted similar procedures. Other officers used rank to offload risk. They'd order subordinates to open bottles first, or they'd give bottles as gifts to French workers or junior personnel. If the bottle exploded, the officer was safely away. If it didn't, the wine was proven safe and could be drunk. This created yet another layer of resentment and fear among lower-ranking German personnel and French civilians forced to serve as unwilling bomb testers. The SOE monitored these behavioral changes through intelligence reports from resistance members and by interrogating German prisoners. They were pleased to learn that the explosive bottle program was achieving effects far beyond the actual casualties. In late 1943, the SOE expanded the program beyond wine bottles. They created explosive cognac bottles, explosive liqueur bottles, and even explosive cans of food. The principle was the same: make deadly weapons that looked like desirable luxury goods. But wine remained the primary focus because wine had the strongest cultural significance. For German officers stationed in France, requisitioning fine French wine was one of the perquisites of occupation, a way of enjoying their position and feeling sophisticated. The explosive wine bottles turned this pleasure into a source of dread. There are documented cases of German officers becoming so paranoid that they would only drink schnapps imported from Germany, or beer, or water, anything except French wine. Some officers shipped their wine requisitions back to Germany unopened, intending to enjoy them after the war when they'd presumably be safer. The SOE even anticipated this. Some explosive bottles were designed with long-delay fuses that could remain stable for months or years. A German officer might ship a bottle back to Germany, store it for the duration of the war, and then die when he finally opened it in 1946 to celebrate his survival. The psychological warfare aspect extended to German military families. Officers would write letters home mentioning the danger of explosive bottles, warning their families not to open any French wine or spirits that might be sent from France. This spread fear beyond the military to German civilian population. By 1944, as Allied forces were preparing for D-Day, the explosive wine bottle program was still active, but its role had shifted. It was less about causing casualties and more about maintaining an atmosphere of fear and paranoia among German occupying forces. Every German officer in France knew about the explosive bottles. Many knew someone who had been killed or wounded by one. All of them had to make decisions every day about whether to risk drinking French wine. And the SOE made sure that the supply of explosive bottles, while limited, was enough to ensure that the threat remained real. If months went by without an incident, German officers might start to relax and think the danger had passed. Then there would be another explosion, another death, and the fear would spike again. It was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation, using a relatively small number of weapons to create a vastly disproportionate psychological impact. As Allied forces liberated France in 1944, the explosive wine bottle program entered its final phase. The SOE faced a new problem: how to prevent Allied soldiers and French civilians from being killed by their own weapons. By August 1944, there were an estimated 800 to 1,200 explosive wine bottles still in circulation, sitting in German wine stores, cached in abandoned headquarters, or mixed into civilian wine supplies that Germans had stolen and then abandoned during retreat. The SOE issued urgent warnings through resistance networks and to advancing Allied forces: do not drink any wine of uncertain origin. All suspicious bottles should be treated as potential explosives. But this warning was difficult to enforce. Allied soldiers liberating French towns found German supply dumps full of wine. The temptation to celebrate liberation with confiscated German wine stocks was overwhelming. There are confirmed cases of Allied soldiers being killed or wounded by explosive bottles they found in abandoned German facilities. In one tragic incident, a group of American soldiers found a cache of champagne in a German headquarters near Reims in September 1944. They decided to celebrate with the champagne. One soldier opened a bottle, and the resulting explosion killed him and wounded 3 others. Investigation revealed it was one of the SOE's explosive champagne bottles, never consumed by the Germans but deadly nonetheless. Similar incidents occurred throughout the liberation period. French civilians, desperate for any luxury goods after years of deprivation, would scavenge abandoned German installations for food, wine, and other supplies. Some found explosive bottles and died when they tried to open them. The SOE tried to track down their own weapons. They provided descriptions of the explosive bottles to Allied military police and French authorities, explaining the subtle differences that might distinguish a fake bottle from a real one. But many of the differences were nearly invisible, and there was no practical way to inspect every wine bottle in France. By late 1944, the SOE made a difficult decision: they would detonate or destroy all known caches of explosive bottles, even though this meant destroying a weapon that was still potentially useful. Teams of specialists visited sites where explosive bottles had been stored or cached. They carefully collected the bottles and transported them to remote locations for controlled detonation. But not all the bottles could be recovered. Some had been distributed too widely. Some had ended up in locations that couldn't be determined. Some had been taken by German forces retreating to Germany. The best the SOE could do was continue to issue warnings and hope that explosive bottles would eventually be identified and disposed of safely. After the war, there was a reckoning. The explosive wine bottle program had been incredibly successful in terms of psychological warfare but had also caused unintended casualties among Allied personnel and French civilians. Was it worth it? Military historians have debated this question. The program killed perhaps 40 to 50 German officers directly and possibly saved Allied lives by degrading German morale and effectiveness. But it also killed at least a dozen Allied soldiers and French civilians in the post-liberation period. In pure numbers, this seems like a terrible trade-off. But the psychological impact is harder to quantify. If the explosive bottles contributed to German paranoia and reduced the effectiveness of the occupation, if they made German officers more cautious and less willing to integrate with French society, if they created an atmosphere of fear that undermined German control, then the strategic value might have been significant even if the direct casualties were modest. The program also demonstrated principles of psychological warfare that would influence future operations. The idea of using everyday objects as weapons to create pervasive fear and paranoia became a recognized tactic. The concept of asymmetric warfare, using weapons that the enemy cannot effectively counter or retaliate against, became central to special operations doctrine. In the decades after the war, several countries developed similar programs. The CIA reportedly experimented with explosive consumer goods during the Cold War. Soviet intelligence agencies developed explosives disguised as everyday items for use in sabotage operations. The SOE's wine bottle program had opened a new chapter in covert warfare. One unexpected legacy was in the wine industry itself. After the war, French wine producers had to work hard to rebuild trust in their products. Some German wine importers were reluctant to resume business with French suppliers, citing lingering fears about sabotaged bottles. French wine export associations issued elaborate authentication systems to prove their wines were genuine. High-end wine producers began using more sophisticated anti-tampering measures in their bottle seals and labels, partly to reassure customers that their products hadn't been weaponized. For decades after the war, stories of explosive wine bottles remained classified. The full details of the SOE program were not publicly revealed until documents were declassified in the 1980s and 90s. When the truth finally emerged, it caused a mixture of fascination and horror. The ingenuity of the weapon design was admired, but the indiscriminate nature of the weapon, the fact that it could kill anyone who opened it, regardless of whether they were a legitimate military target, raised ethical questions. The story of the SOE's explosive wine bottles teaches us several important lessons about warfare, psychology, and the ethics of weapon design. First, it demonstrates the power of psychological warfare. The explosive bottles killed perhaps 50 people directly but affected the behavior and mental state of thousands. The fear they created was out of all proportion to the actual danger. This is the essence of terrorism, using violence or the threat of violence to create fear that changes behavior on a large scale. The SOE's use of this tactic raises uncomfortable questions. Was it legitimate warfare or was it terrorism? The distinction often depends on who's using the weapon and for what cause. The Allies considered it clever psychological warfare. The Germans considered it terrorism. From a modern perspective, we can see elements of both. Second, the wine bottle program illustrates the principle of asymmetric warfare. The explosive bottles were a weapon that only worked in one direction. Britain could deploy them in occupied France because British agents and French resistance members had access to German supply chains. Germany couldn't retaliate with the same tactic because they didn't have equivalent access to British supply chains in Britain. This asymmetry made the weapon particularly effective. It created a threat that Germany couldn't counter except by abandoning French wine entirely. This principle, finding weapons or tactics that you can use but your enemy cannot easily copy, remains central to unconventional warfare strategy today. Third, the story shows the double-edged nature of deception weapons. The explosive wine bottles were effective precisely because they were indistinguishable from real wine bottles. But this same characteristic made them dangerous to everyone, including Allied forces and civilians. There was no way to turn off the weapon once deployed. The explosive bottles would kill whoever opened them, regardless of whether that person was a legitimate military target. This is a fundamental ethical problem with certain types of weapons. Landmines, for example, have the same issue. They remain dangerous long after the conflict that deployed them is over, and they kill and maim civilians for decades. The explosive wine bottles were similar in principle, though shorter-lived because bottles don't remain in place the way landmines do. Fourth, the wine bottle program demonstrates the importance of understanding your enemy's culture and psychology. The SOE chose wine bottles as a weapon specifically because they understood that German officers valued French wine and would actively seek it out. If German officers had been indifferent to wine, the weapon would have been useless. The success of the weapon depended on exploiting cultural preferences and desires. This principle extends to modern warfare and intelligence operations. Understanding the enemy's culture, values, and psychology is often more important than understanding their military capabilities. If you know what they want, what they fear, what they value, you can find ways to exploit those psychological factors. Fifth, the story raises questions about the proportionality and necessity of certain weapons. Was it necessary to create a weapon that could kill indiscriminately, that relied on deception so complete that friend and foe alike might fall victim? The SOE argued yes, that in total war against an evil regime, any effective weapon was justified. Critics argued no, that certain methods of killing, even against a legitimate enemy, cross ethical lines that should not be crossed. There's no clear answer to this debate. The men who designed and deployed the explosive wine bottles believed they were helping to defeat Nazi Germany and liberate Europe. The German officers who died opening them were part of an occupying military force serving an evil regime. But some of the French civilians and Allied soldiers who died in the aftermath were innocent victims of a weapon that couldn't distinguish friend from foe. Finally, The explosive wine bottle story reminds us that warfare is ultimately about the human mind as much as about physical destruction. The bottles killed 50 people but terrorized thousands. They destroyed German officers' enjoyment of one of life's simple pleasures and turned every bottle of wine into a potential death sentence. This psychological impact was arguably more valuable than the physical casualties. Modern special operations and psychological warfare doctrine takes these lessons seriously. The goal is often not to kill the maximum number of enemies but to create the maximum psychological effect, to make the enemy feel unsafe, uncertain, unable to trust their surroundings, and demoralized about their chances of victory. The SOE's wine bottles were an early and particularly clever example of this approach. They turned something pleasant, a glass of fine French wine, into something terrifying. They weaponized desire and turned celebration into a moment of mortal danger. Looking back from 80 years' distance, we can appreciate the cleverness and effectiveness of the explosive wine bottle program while also recognizing its ethical ambiguities. It was ingenious. It was effective. It was psychologically devastating. And it raises questions about the limits of acceptable warfare that remain relevant today. The explosive wine bottles are gone now, either detonated, destroyed, or rusted into harmlessness. But their legacy remains in military doctrine, in the history of psychological warfare, and in the reminder that sometimes the most effective weapons are not the ones that destroy the most but the ones that terrify the most. And sometimes, the most deadly thing in the room is not a gun or a bomb but a simple bottle of wine that looks exactly like what you want it to be, right up until the moment you open it.